Okay, forget everything you thought you knew about history and economics. We're taught a really simple logical rule, right? Extractive colonialism always leaves behind crushing poverty. You steal the wealth, the place gets poorer. It makes sense. But what if the data proves the exact opposite? What if brutal exploitation accidentally built the foundation for modern wealth? Welcome to This Explainer. We are diving straight into a massive, mind-bending historical contradiction today. Prepare for a serious reality check. The myth is that colonial plunder strictly equals modern poverty. But the reality is completely wild. Back in the 19th century, the Dutch forced parts of Java into an incredibly harsh labor system, draining massive wealth right out of the island. Yet today, the exact places subjected to the most brutal extraction are actually significantly richer. They're more educated, more industrialized. It literally defies logic, and honestly, it feels like a flap in the face to our basic understanding of justice.
So, we gotta ask the big question, staring us right in the face. How? How on earth did a brutal, extractive, colonial system accidentally build modern wealth? And listen, this isn't just some historical fluke. We're looking at hard, undeniable economic data collected from thousands of Indonesian villages. Today, we're unpacking the counterintuitive mechanics behind this. It's a crazy story of greed, totally unintended consequences, and the permanent scars of infrastructure. All right, Section 1, the sugar machine processing wealth.
To figure out this paradox, we have to jump back to the 1830s. The Dutch Empire was literally running out of money, and global demand for sugar was absolutely exploding. So they created the Dutch Cultivation System. Look at this ruthless step-by-step logic. Step 1, demand sugar. Step 2, force local peasants to grow it. But here's where history takes a weird turn. Step 3, raw sugarcane is super heavy and it rots fast. You can't just ship it to Europe raw. You have to process it locally. So the Dutch were forced to build high-tech factories right next to the fields. And step 4, to export that sugar, they paved roads and built railways straight to the ports. They definitely didn't do this out of kindness. They just wanted to steal more efficiently. But those roads and factories, they couldn't be unbuilt. Just look at the terrifying scale of this operation. The Dutch set up what's known as the circle system. They built 94 massive water-powered factories across the island. Around each factory, they drew a tight 4 to 7 kilometer radius. And if you lived inside that circle, your life was no longer yours. Millions of forced laborers were trapped in this. Entire traditional village economies were just completely erased and reorganized into a rigid industrial network. It was basically factory town capitalism, forced at gunpoint.
Which brings us to Section 2. The phantom factory test, proving causality.
Now, any good skeptic is probably pausing right now, thinking, wait a second, maybe the Dutch just built these factories in places with perfect geography. Maybe those spots were destined to be rich anyway. It's a totally fair point. To prove this wasn't just geographical luck, the researchers used this brilliant method called the placebo factory test. They mapped out all the other spots on the exact same rivers with the exact same perfect geography, but where the Dutch never actually built a factory. Then they simulated 1,000 fake or placebo factory locations and crunched the modern economic data for them. The result? Nothing. Zero extra wealth today. The wealth only exists around the real historical factories. Geography didn't make them rich. The colonial machine did.
Moving on to Section 3, the infrastructure legacy, ghost of the system. Because, the Dutch eventually left, the original factories collapsed, but the ghost of that system, it's still dictating who is rich and who is poor in Indonesia today. Look at the shape of this modern data. Researchers call it a hockey stick drop-off. See how agricultural reliance drops sharply right near the historic factories. The second you cross that 5-kilometer line, which remember was the exact radius of the old forced labor circles, agricultural jobs just vanish. They're replaced by modern retail and manufacturing. The factories are long gone, but their economic gravity is literally still pulling people out of the fields today.
Let me anchor that chart with a really visceral, everyday reality for you. Today, if your home sits near one of these historical factory sites, your household consumes 14% more goods and services than a household just a few kilometers away. 14%. In developmental economics, that is a massive, massive leap. It's the difference between just struggling to get by and actually thriving, and it is entirely dictated by where some doctor officer decided to build a water wheel back in 1830. Crazy, right? It's all thanks to this chain reaction we call the agglomeration snowball. Here's how it worked. The Dutch paved roads, and those roads persisted. Because of the roads, new downstream food processing industries clustered there.
Because those industries were there, these specific villages got on the electricity grid way earlier. And because they had power and industry, the government built high schools there much faster in the 1980s. It's basically an unstoppable snowball of progress that was completely jump-started by historical extortion. Section 4. The village boundary effect. Inside the catchment zone. Okay, we can't just talk about the factory buildings here. We really have to look at the human element, the specific villages trapped inside that boundary. Imagine a line drawn in the dirt, on one side villages forced to grow sugar, where the Dutch empowered corrupt local village heads to force their neighbors into the fields. On the other side, literally just a mile away, villages left completely alone to just continue their traditional farming. The economic difference between these two sides today is absolutely staggering. Here is the super counterintuitive chain reaction. The Dutch empowered those village chiefs to hit their sugar quotas, right? Well, the chiefs used that power to seize massive amounts of communal land. It was pure corruption. But when the Dutch left and Indonesia gained independence, all that seized land actually remained public property. So what did the villages do with it? They leased it out, and they used the cash to fund local public schools. Basically, Dutch corruption accidentally created a massive funding mechanism for modern education. And the hard data proves this flawlessly. Today, individuals who grew up inside those historic forced labor boundaries have an average of 1.25 more years of formal schooling. That is huge. And this isn't just some recent trend either. Researchers actually tracked this exact education gap all the way back to kids born in the 1920s. That traumatic reorganization of their villages resulted in a permanent, century-long educational advantage.
Section 5. The price of progress, the ultimate nuance. All right, we need to pull back for a second here. We are reporting the data, not making moral justifications. And data has blind spots, right? Economic metrics can measure households' consumption and school years perfectly, but they absolutely cannot measure cultural destruction. The fact that forced labor left a positive economic footprint does not erase the trauma, the coercion, and the sheer theft endured by millions. To really grasp this, look at another brutal colonial regime, the Belgian Congo. There, colonizers extracted wild rubber, but rubber didn't need local factories or roads, so the Belgians just used pure violence to extract it, leaving behind zero infrastructure and absolute devastation that persists today. But in Dutch Java, because sugar is heavy and rots, extraction forced them to build local processing and a modern grid. Basically, how an empire extracts its resources completely determines the economic DNA it leaves behind. Which brings us to this brilliant conclusion from the authors. Quote, "The direction of the long-run economic impacts of extractive institutions are inextricably linked with the specifics of how these institutions functioned. In plain English, the devil is in the details." The Dutch only built that infrastructure to steal more efficiently. But once they were kicked out, the roads, the power lines, the factory towns, they remained. And the newly independent Javanese people cleverly hijacked this leftover colonial machinery to build their own wealth. So this leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable question to end on. Does the brutal, violent method of historical exploitation justify the accidental progress left behind? The data clearly shows the wealth is real, the schools are real, but they were bought and paid for with generations of forced labor. It's a paradox that completely shatters our neat, tidy view of history. Good actions don't always create wealth, and terrible actions don't always create poverty. The data doesn't care about our feelings. I really hope this explainer shifted how you view the deeply complicated shadows of our global economy. Keep questioning the obvious, and as always, keep following the data.